The grand narrative of Egypt is one written by kings. It begins with the first pharaohs who forged a kingdom from the fertile black soil of the Nile. Before them, we were told, there was only a vast, unwritten silence, a prehistory of scattered tribes, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the hunt and the flicker of a campfire. Yet deep within the desolate expanse of the western desert, a place now surrendered to sun and sand, an artifact of a forgotten world emerged. A message not from a bottle, but from the bedrock of time itself. And suddenly, the silence of that distant past began to speak. It spoke of a world that defies our timeline, a world that rearranges the very first chapters of human ambition. To understand this message, we must first unlearn the desert we see today. We must imagine this ocean of sand as it once was, a verdant savanna, a land of seasonal lakes shimmering under a vast sky where grasslands stretched to the horizon and mons. It was here, hundreds of kilometers from the temples of the Nile, that archaeologists uncovered what should not exist. At first glance, it was nothing more than a ruin of a ruin, a scattering of stones almost lost to the landscape. Upright megaliths, weathered and broken, duted times and sea only geology. But with a trained eye, a pattern begins to emerge from the chaos. These stones are not random. They are arranged. They form lines of sight. They trace the arc of a great circle. And this circle, built in the heart of nowhere, seems to be aimed with impossible precision, not at a landmark, not at a settlement, but at the heavens. And with that realization, a cascade of questions begins. Who were the people who dragged these monoliths across a green Sahara? Why here, in this remote basin that filled with water only part of the year? And most profoundly, why did they invest generations of effort to align their creation with the solstices, the great turning points of the sun's journey? This was not the work of simple survival. This was the work of observation, of memory, of a people reaching for cosmic order. Excavations dug deeper, peeling back the layers of sand and time. They revealed more than just stones. They found organized burials, bodies laid to rest with care. They unearthed the remains of cattle, not simply discarded, but placed with clear ritual intention. This was a society told a different tale. When radiocarbon dating was applied, the results were staggering. The timeline shattered. The ages pointed not to the dawn of the pharaohs, but thousands of years earlier. This calendar of rock was older than the first stones of Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by millennia. Here lies the unsettling truth. One can build a shelter in an afternoon. One can hunt, gather, and move with the seasons. That is the rhythm of existence. But you do not quarry and haul multi-ton slabs of rock by accident. You do not spend generations charting the slow dance of the sun across the sky out of boredom. You undertake such a monumental task for one reason, because something beyond mere survival has become essential. Something about time, the stars, and humanity's place within the cosmos matters so deeply that it must be given form, locked into the earth itself. The pattern is not just in the stones. It is the first faint blueprint of civilization itself. Before the first pharaoh, before the twin lands were bound by a single crown, there was the sand and the river. The accepted narrative paints a familiar scene, the slow, inexorable birth of a complex society. Here, scattered communities learn to read the pulse of the seasons, anticipating the life-giving flood. They chart the silent march of the stars, turning the heavens into a map for navigation and a clock for planting. They weave intricate rituals, binding themselves together against the caprice of the desert. It is a human story, a logical progression, grounded and believable. But in Egypt, the ground itself is fractured. The story has cracks, and through them, a different light shines. The Great Pyramids of Giza do not rise from the earth, they erupt. Frozen lightning bolts of limestone and granite, their geometry aligned to the cardinal points with a precision that defies the supposed tools of their age. The Sphinx, that silent sentinel, greets the dawn with the face of a king, yet its body tells another tale. It is a body, weathered and worn by forces that whisper of deep time, of torrential rains in an epoch before the Pharaohs, sparking a furious debate between geology and history. We descend beneath the sands at Sahara, into the subterranean bloom of the Serapeum. Here, in galleries carved from the bedrock, wait monolithic sarcophagi, 25 granite boxes, each weighing up to 100 tons in artisan's finish. These are not mere silent rebuke to simple explanations, and in the curated halls of museums, other enigmas lie hidden. Its shape seems to belong to another world, a design from a future or parallel timeline, inexplicably dropped into a First Dynasty tomb. Mainstream archaeology offers answers, of course. For many of these puzzles, the explanations are robust, built on decades of painstaking work. Yet the emotional force, the deep and unsettling resonance of ancient Egypt, comes not from what is known, but from what remains profoundly unresolved. Why does this civilization's obscured sketch? It is here, in that space of doubt, that a discovery in Thive prelude, but something else entirely. A culture of deliberate, symbolic, and at times, astonishingly sophisticated expression. If this is true, then the entire dynastic pageant of the Nile did not spring from the mud, fully formed. It was an inheritance. Consider what Egypt would become. It was a culture utterly consumed by the rhythm of cycles. The daily death and rebirth of the sun god Ra, the annual flood and retreat of the Nile, the very heartbeat of the land. The soul's journey through the afterlife, a perilous voyage across a meticulously mapped cosmos. This worldview was not just belief, it was engineering. Their architecture became a machine for eternity, with stone locked into celestial alignments and monuments positioned as if the geography of the earth itself were a sacred diagram. Now, rewind the tape. What if the seeds of that cosmic mindset were not planted on the crowded, fertile banks of the Nile? What if they were sown generations earlier, out in the vast, silent emptiness of the western desert, under a canopy of stars so brilliant and clear, they seemed within arm's reach? And then, the timeline darkens, stretching back into a past haunted by a planetary ghost. There is a date that looms over deep history, the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,800 years ago. This was not a gentle warming, but a period of violent climatic upheaval. Temperatures flipped, ice dams burst, and the seas rose with terrifying speed, drowning entire landscapes and swallowing coastlines that had been home to humanity for millennia. Some researchers speak of abrupt, catastrophic cooling events, of cosmic impacts and solar flares, dramatic shifts that would have shattered any stable way of life. And whenever human civilization faces chaos of that magnitude, a great winnowing occurs. Knowledge is lost, scattered to the winds, or it is compressed. This is the thrilling, terrifying possibility that the evidence now allows us to consider. What if a global catastrophe truly reset the board? What if the megalithic circles and alignments scattered across the world's deserts are not the first tentative steps of humanity towards civilization? What if they are not the beginning of something new, but the last, fading echoes of something immeasurably old? What if it is not a beginning at all, but an end? A surviving tradition, a final echo of a world that vanished, a knowledge that moved inland as the waters rose and the green lands turned to dust. What if, etched into these stones, is not the dawn of an idea, but its twilight? A memory of how to read the sky, how to mark the inexorable passage of the seasons, how to encode profound meaning into the only medium that survives when everything else burns, floods, or decays. This explanation requires no visitors from the stars, no appeal to forgotten magic. It requires only two things we know to be true: immense spans of time and the certainty of catastrophic loss. But the human imagination rarely stops at the threshold of the known. Once we admit that the timeline is more fragile, more flexible than the neat summaries in our textbooks, other frameworks come rushing into the vacuum. The mythic structures arise, whispering of a lost, golden civilization, of gods who descended to teach humanity the sacred arts of architecture and agriculture. The idea of a forbidden knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, engineering of a higher order, passed down through secretive priesthoods hidden in Eswa. Some interpret these myths with a stark literalism. They speak of the Anunnaki, of ancient astronauts, of celestial visitors who uplifted a primitive humanity as if we were a planetary science project. Mainstream scholarship, in its careful sobriety, will tell you that these myths are metaphor, grand poetry about power, the cycles of nature, and the architecture of the human mind. And they may well be right. But the reason those literal, more exotic interpretations keep returning, generation after generation, is devastatingly simple. The monument on such a colossal scale, not aligned with such celestial accuracy. When you stand before something that makes you feel profoundly small, your mind instinctively searches for an explanation big enough to match the emotion. And yet, there remains a possibility more unsettling, and perhaps more magnificent, than any tale of aliens. What if the builders were simply us? Not our modern selves, armed with steel and satellites and laser levels, but humans with long memories. Humans living through uncounted centuries of patient observation, inheriting techniques, refining them generation by generation, and then, crucially, forgetting parts of them when their world collapsed. A civilization does not have to be global to be advanced in a few key skills. It is entirely possible to have expert stoneworkers without electricity, to have brilliant astronomers without telescopes, to have masterful engineers without complex machines. All that is required is time, a sophisticated social organization, and a reason, a belief, a purpose, strong enough to move mountains. Seen through this lens, a discovery in the desert becomes more than an isolated archaeological site. It becomes a clue in a much larger mystery. The dynastic miracle of Egypt may not be a sudden, spontaneous flowering in the Nile Valley. It may be but one chapter in a much longer book. A book with its opening pages torn out by climate change, by floods, and by the slow, grinding passage of sand. And that brings us to the most suspenseful question of all. What else is buried? Because the deserts of the world do not just erase, they preserve. The wind can scour a surface clean, but the sand can also act as a vault. It can be a destroyer, but it can also be a perfect tomb. If something magnificent was built, then abandoned and swallowed by the dunes, it might still be there, waiting, intact, in a sealed room beneath the surface of the world. Imagine it. A line of stones standing sentinel in the wastes. A circle that locks onto the sun at a precise moment in its journey. A ritual landscape, older than the dynasties, older than the first pharaohs. And somewhere nearby, beneath layers of wind-blown time, lies something we have not yet found. An older structure, a cache of knowledge carved in a language we have yet to decipher. The one artifact that proves the book of our past is far longer and far stranger than we have ever dared to imagine. What if evidence surfaced that did not merely hint at early complexity, but proved it beyond all argument? An artifact so disruptive it would force us to concede that someone, somewhere, possessed knowledge that appears uncomfortably advanced for its age. If such a clear, undeniable object were ever found, would it rewrite our timeline? Or would it vanish into academic debates, labeled an anomaly too inconvenient to place? Perhaps that object has already been found, hidden not in a lost city, but within the silent archives of a museum drawer. It is a single tooth, small enough to rest in the palm of a hand, yet carrying the weight to crack a legend wide open. For 5,000 years, the great monoliths of Stonehenge have guarded their secrets. Who built this impossible circle of stone, and for what purpose? The questions have echoed through millennia. But recently, a clue emerged from the earth, a tiny fragment of bone that has begun to unravel the mystery. The truth it. The story begins not in our time, but in the year 1924. Archaeologists, working meticulously near the monument's southern entrance, unearthed the jawbone of a cow. To them, it seemed ordinary, perhaps even irrelevant, a relic of ancient agriculture. It was catalogued, boxed, and for nearly a century, largely forgotten. Yet hidden within that jaw was a single molar, holding secrets as ancient as the stones themselves. What no one could have realized then was that this tooth was more than bone and enamel. It was a time capsule, preserving a record of place, of movement, of a long journey written in an indelible chemical code. For 100 years it lay silent, until science finally developed a language to read its silent story. By measuring the isotopes of oxygen, strontium, and lead locked within the enamel, researchers can now trace the origins of the animal to which it once belonged. Each bite of grass, each drink of water, leaves behind a geological signature, a permanent map of a life lived throughscapes. They tell us not just what an animal was, but precisely where it had been.